Okay, right. Well, we're ready to go. Um, I'm going to talk as wisdom said about what I think is perhaps the strangest thing ever to have happened, and that's what drew me to this topic. I should begin by saying that I'm a historian largely of the 19th and 20th centuries, and largely science and medicine, although my work more recently is looking at much broader swathes of time. The reason I came to this topic is that I'd been asked to teach a class on the history of psychiatry, and I wanted a good backdrop for talking about modern developments. So I went back to the late medieval period and looked at mental illness in that period and how people responded to it. And I came across reference to a plague of dancing. And that immediately piqued my interest. But I think probably like most other people, I initially thought that this couldn't possibly be true. We all know that chroniclers of that period were prone to exaggeration or pure invention. So I didn't take it particularly seriously. I came across a couple of other mentions of it and then decided to look in a little bit more depth. And I think that's partly because, like a lot of historians, I'm probably a frustrated novelist. And here was an opportunity to capture a period that is so exotically different from our own. And I was drawn into it. And the more I read, and the more I realized how well documented it was, it became absolutely apparent that this had actually happened. And it wasn't even the only case of large-scale involuntary dancing. And so I decided I would tell this story. And from that came this book that came out in 2009, I believe, called A Time to Dance, A Time to Die. So, but I want to show you some pictures so I can help conjure up what happened in 1518. Incidentally, of course, we are just over 500 years from this event taking place. Okay, so all the I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes to tell you what happened in Strasbourg in 1518, and then offer what I think is a credible explanation for why this happened and what implications it might have. All of the events we're talking about occurred in this city. Strasbourg was a major German city close to the border with France. This isn't exactly the scale. Clearly, the cathedral that you see there did have the tallest spire in the world, but it's outsized in a way that illustrates the importance of religion to people living in Europe at this time. But that is the city of Strasbourg. This is its location. You can see that it's close to the River Rhine that runs roughly north-south across the European continent. Here's another image of Strasbourg at the time, a classic medieval walled city. I don't know if any of you have been there. It's a fabulously beautiful place, historically incredibly well preserved. Well, the events I'm going to be talking about began around about the middle of July in 1518. And a couple of chronicles and a couple of other sources claim that it began with one woman, and a couple of them name her as Frau Truffia. And they say that one day she just walked outside of her home and she started to dance. And she continued to dance all through the day, and people at first thought that she was having fun, or one of them speculated that she was doing it to annoy her husband. But by nightfall, she was still going. 2 days later, she was still going. One chronicle says that she danced for 4 days almost continuously, at which point that she was bundled into a cart and she was taken out of the town. Nobody knows what then happened to her. But within about a week, the chronicles say, there was something like 20 or 30 people who were dancing in this compulsive fashion, hours and hours and hours, hardly stopping to eat, rest, or drink, going on and on and on. And very soon, these people would have had bruised and lacerated feet. because it didn't seem to be capable of stopping this constant dancing. Well, at first, as far as one can tell, the city authorities didn't pay much attention to what was going on. But by the time the number of dancers had climbed to about 40 or 50, eventually it got to at least 200. And people at the time claimed that well over 400 at one time or another had been consumed by this irresistible urge to dance. Well, fairly soon they realized they've got to do something about it. Now, if you're living in a medieval city like Strasbourg, this kind of thing breaks out, you're very likely early on to go and ask the religious authorities. And clearly they weighed in. Now, Strasbourg was rather interesting because it was mostly run by a mercantile elite, so wealthy merchants, in addition to a number of aristocrats who had land close to Strasbourg. They're the people who really ran the city, and they had a very bad relationship with the bishop because the bishop was a rival center of power. And in fact, the bishop didn't even live in the city. He lived in a much smaller city to the north called Saverne. So this might be one of the reasons why they were somewhat reluctant to accept religious advice on what they should do about this. Well, what they certainly do is they consult astrologers. This is a point at which astrology is at the very, very heart of philosophy and medicine. There is a very well-established assumption that the stars and the planets control significant aspects of human life. And surviving from the period are the accounts of astrologers saying this dance is happening because of this particular conjunction in the heavens. But the authorities also go to the local physicians. And Strasbourg has a number of very well-known at the time physicians. Now, one thing I should say about how we know any of this, with this outbreak of dancing in Strasbourg, it's not only that the chronicles record it. The city's led by a highly literate group of men who were actually writing down their thoughts and suggestions during the course of the epidemic. These amazingly survived, at least they did until the Prussians shelled the city in 1870. But fortunately, copies had at that point been made and preserved. So you can actually, in some detail, follow the events written at the time by these eyewitnesses. Well, they go to the physicians, and this is a point at which medicine is absolutely based on the classical tradition. So the idea is that ill health comes about because of an imbalance in the fluids within your body. Most medical education would involve reading texts which had been written 1,000 or more years before. Now, in this case, the physicians were adamant they knew what was causing it. It was too much hot blood. It's exactly what Galen would have said in the Roman era. And the notion was that the summer was so incredibly hot that people were producing too much blood. It was roaring into their brains and causing them to act in this frenzied manner. But what's curious is their prescription, because their prescription you would never find in Galen or the Hippocratics. What they recommend is that these people be kept dancing. So what they recommend is more dancing, as much as they can possibly tolerate. So the city proceeds to hire every available musician, everybody with a drum or a flute or bagpipes. They are paid a small amount of money. They gather in certain places to keep the dancers going. But the even more bizarre thing is that they hired the healthy in order to accompany these people in their dancing. They actually paid scores of people to help keep the dancers on their feet. They wouldn't let them rest. And what they did was this area you can see here is the old grain market. It's quite a large area close to the center of the city. They commandeered that, and they took a load of dancers there. Then here is the old horse fair, and they put up a great big stage. And there they took more dancers, and each one of these places would have its musicians and its paid dancers. Then they also took over a couple of the lower status guild halls, and then they took dancers there as well. Now, you could just imagine the bizarre spectacle that they were creating here. You think of those bizarre scenes created by Hieronymus Bosch, the artist of this period. It would have been so incredibly like that. So, you know, these kinds of wild dances, we don't know how they danced, but people obviously in agony, in a trance-like state, just going on and on and on. It would have been absolutely terrifying. Well, one thing that all of the writers who describe what happened agree on is that it soon proved fatal. Here's an example from an early 17th century chronicle. But contemporary ones say exactly the same thing. They were keeling over and dying in the street. And this summer in Strasbourg was famously hot. And you can imagine that if you were dancing and not being allowed to rest, barely drinking anything in that grain market, and the sun would have been punishing. If you've got a weak heart, poor circulation, there's a good chance you're going to die. Here's another description by a chronicler. Okay, well, after a week or so of this strategy, the city authorities realize that whatever they're doing, it's not a good idea. Nobody knows how many people died. There is there's a philosopher who was living just outside Strasbourg who claimed 15 people a day were dying. Maybe at the very height of the epidemic, that's possible. But we'll never know how many people actually perished, but enough for the city authorities to decide that they had to try something else. And here's a translation of one of the memos that was later transcribed. Basically, the point of this is we've got to stop people from dancing. And if they're going to dance, then make sure that they're not doing it in a public place. Because they say at the end here, nobody should dance because by doing so, they take away the recovery of such persons. It seems clear that people were dancing, slipping out of the dance state, but then being drawn back into it. So dancing was prohibited in nearly all situations, and you'd be in big trouble if you did any dancing in public. And this also then triggers a wave of contrition. The city decides that the reason these people are dancing is that they're cursed. Somehow they must have offended God or a saint, and they're being punished by this deadly dance. And it wouldn't have been hard to find examples of sin in Strasbourg at this time. Here are a few examples. These are actually woodcuts from the time. Very, very high levels of prostitution, gambling, and so on. And a couple of weeks after that, they take all of the remaining dancers, they bundle them up, and they take them by cart to this place called Saverne, which is where the bishop's residence is. And you can see in the background there are some hills. If you climb into those hills, you come to a grotto. This is as it appeared then. It's exactly the same now, except that most of the statues have been removed to the museum in the valley. This was a grotto which was dedicated to a saint called Saint Vitus. And they get the dancers off the carts. Then they put red shoes on them. It's a really curious detail. They bless the red shoes. Then they lead the dancers around the shrine, make an offering to the hermit who lives in this little chapel, which is on the top of the bluff of rock. The grotto you saw is just below that buttress. And then, as far as one can tell, the epidemic peters out. And that's pretty much the last you hear of it in Strasbourg, except for a couple of much smaller outbreaks in the region that occur about 20 years later. Here's the it's got a bas relief carving of Saint Vitus, to whom that shrine was dedicated. Pope Marcellus on the left, and obviously the Virgin Mary in the middle. Okay, so that is a brief description of what happened. When I decided to write about this, my assumption was that it would be impossible to recover what caused it. And I thought it would make an interesting case study in the fact that you cannot just go back to the past using modern theories and explain what happened. Maybe some diseases, particularly expressions of mental illness, might just make no sense. It might make sense only within their time periods. So that was my starting hypothesis. But there was another one that I was aware of, and that has to do with ergot. And so ergot, you may be aware of, used to be a significant threat in Europe, in many other parts of the world. On the right, you can see this mold growing on rye. If you ingested ergot, you would end up with ergotism, and ergotism is not to be recommended. It causes massive constriction in the peripheral veins and arteries, and the result of that typically is gangrene. So you can see on the left here, this is Saint Anthony, who was the saint associated with this condition. Typically you would die, but some cases the infection would simply lead to your hands and feet dropping off. And in some of those cases, you would actually survive. It was unbelievably painful, but it was also associated with depression and hallucinations. And so it was quite often suggested in the few texts available that this kind of event was caused by ergot poisoning. The bottom left is a carving that you can see where its ears are. You can see holes. These would have been bolted onto the pipes that came out of the granaries in Strasbourg and elsewhere. This one's from Strasbourg. And basically what they were reminding people is, if you take this milled flour and make bread, and then start feeling intense pain in your extremities and hallucinating, you've got ergotism. That's what it is. So stop eating that bread. So every time people took their sack to the miller and filled it up with flour, they had that reminder, basically the health warning that came with it. So this was one reasonable hypothesis, but I consulted a number of neurologists about this who said it's absolutely inconceivable that somebody suffering from ergotism could stand up and dance for a sustained period of time. Coordinated movement would have been out of the question if you're dealing with this kind of sickness. So the simple explanation was very quickly blown out of the water. Speaking of water, it was only when I decided to plot the recorded cases of these outbreaks of compulsive dancing that things began to make more sense. There are something like 10, maybe 15 possible cases of compulsive dancing from around about the 11th century AD till the late 1500s. Some of them are clearly just allegories, but those for which there is good evidence all occur very close to the River Rhine or along one of its tributaries. Now, these are areas which are growing different crops. They're different in so many different respects. The one thing, of course, they have in common is a river. And a river is the way in which you transport not only food and wares to sell, but also ideas. So for me, this was a good indication that ideas have got something to do with what happened. And I arrived eventually at the view that this is a case of mass psychogenic illness, what would in the past have been called mass hysteria. And so I began looking to see if there's any evidence that's consistent with what we know to be the factors that promote cases of mass psychogenic illness. And there are a few things that you frequently see. One of them is a high level of fear, misery, but also beliefs which are conducive to a certain kind of expression of people's distress. So the question was, what were conditions like in Strasbourg in the decades or years and months and weeks leading up to 1518? And were there any beliefs that might have led people in extreme distress to have started dancing, as opposed to rebelling or fighting, screaming, drinking, or any of the many, many other ways in which we express our psychological pain? So what I want to do in the next 10 minutes is quickly give you a sense of what life in late medieval Strasbourg was like. For me, one of the key insights here was derived from reading more about cases of apparent demonic possession in Europe in the 1500s and 1600s. I think we tend to have, partly courtesy of Monty Python, a notion that the witch craze, or people believing themselves to be possessed and acting in bizarre ways, that was very much a medieval thing. In fact, it's really a phenomenon of the 1500s and 1600s. And the reason seems to be that before around about 1500, religious writers didn't really say very much about the possibility of demonic possession. It was only when they started writing about this as something which is likely to occur that when people in a state of extreme fear and anxiety lost touch with reality, they started acting upon those scripts. So what they had been told might happen, they began to play out in their own thoughts and behavior. And that's what I think happened in Strasbourg. Okay, so let's talk about what conditions were like. The first point to make is that the people of Strasbourg in 1517 and 18 were very hungry, unless they were among the richest, say, roughly 20% of people. And the reason for that is there had been a series of catastrophic harvests. Now, you never really look back to a period in the medieval age and say, well, that would have been a nice time to live. Things are always rough. But this period was incredibly hard, even by late medieval standards. So if you chart the price of wheat, which is the real predictor of human well-being in this period, people in this region are paying more for bread than anybody has in living memory. The rates are escalating. Terribly, terribly wet winters and springs, awfully hot summers with occasional storms of hail that just destroy the grapes on the vines and wheat in the fields. People are desperately hungry. Clearly, people are dying of famine, but the other thing they're doing is that they're crowding into the city of Strasbourg in a way that they hadn't done for several decades. These are images from around about this time. This one shows you the orphanage, which is crowded with children who have been orphaned by parents dying of malnutrition and disease. Here's an image from one of the hostels in Strasbourg, overwhelmed by the number of people who are fleeing starvation in the hinterland, coming to try and get some some kind of sustenance from the city itself. This is a terribly poignant image of a woman in 1517 who, calculating that she could no longer feed her existing children if she didn't somehow lose the burden of her latest, she tipped the child into a canal. She was caught and she was executed. Now, one of the things that made this a great deal worse is that peasants were living, even in good years, on the margins of desperation. Once they had paid their rents and their tithes, there was very, very little left for survival, and they dipped below a survivable um, 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 intake of calories in periods of harvest failure. But on top of this, the church in particular had found technical ways around the banning of lending at interest. And very large numbers of the peasants in Alsace, that's the state that Strasbourg is in, were heavily in debt to members of the clergy. The other thing that was happening is that secular and religious landowners were hoarding grain, because as they saw the prices go up, they knew that they just had to wait another week and they'd make even more. And it was very, very difficult for them to sell, because the more they waited, the more they would get. And there was widespread suspicion about it, sometimes exaggerated, but there is absolutely no question that monasteries, the cathedral, other religious institutions were keeping the grain from people because they could get more by selling it elsewhere. So this is an important factor in the growing anti-clericalism, the growing hostility to the church that the chronicles record. This is a woodcut of a movement called the Bundschuh, and the Bundschuh was the peasant's shoe, a very, very cheap shoe. And during the course of the early 1500s, there were a series of failed rebellions led by this man called Jos Fritz. He's a remarkable fellow. He was born a serf, but spent most of his life organizing rebellions, all of which looked as if they were going to work. And then somebody who had signed up as a rebel realized that he could make a lot more money by going to the authorities than he would by taking part in a rebellion. So every single time that somebody rats on them, but Jos Fritz always gets away. But you can get a sense of how much hatred there was for the religious landowner. This is their secret code. If you were a properly signed up member of the Bundschuh, you would be identified, because when somebody would say, "God greet you, fellow, how fares the world?" you would say, "We cannot rid ourselves of the plague of priests." And it's important to remember, of course, that the clerics were sometimes genuinely pious. A lot of the time they were born into the highest social elite, and this was a respectable profession for younger sons who had little to inherit. So relatively few are going into the church driven by a deep sense of vocation. Well, there was other evidence to people in Strasbourg at this time that trouble was afoot. I think one of the other factors, so not only is there an objective sense of distress here because of usury, because of harvest failure, they are terrified because of the arrival of new diseases. And the most important of those was syphilis. The jury's still out on whether or not syphilis came from the Americas. It probably didn't. It was a recent mutation of an existing disease. But in that first generation or two, syphilis was a terrible, terrible disease that killed a large number of those who suffered from it. Now, the reason that syphilis tended to calm down was because sexually transmitted diseases that essentially eat away at a person's face are fairly unlikely to get passed on to someone else. It's a bit of a turnoff. But this was the first generation of syphilis, and it was absolutely terrible. It was even said that lepers felt sorry for them. Because it was associated so strongly with sex, not surprisingly, because the first evidence of it involved a very large ulcer on the genitals, this was seen to be clear punishment for sin. I'm going to rush over these appalling treatments that they instituted. And this takes us on to the next point, that what we can see building up in Strasbourg in the early 1500s is growing anxiety. They're dealing with famine, starvation, diseases. And you can see how they are articulating this in terms of God having abandoned the city, or maybe God having withdrawn his sympathy for the people of Strasbourg because their monks and nuns and priests were so mired in sin. So the arrival of diseases like syphilis plays into this ancient notion that disease originated with an angry God or Christ. You can see in these images here. But if you, the chronicles show this real escalation in the amount of fear that people were experiencing and their conviction that God was giving up on the people in this area. This is the bishop who says that danger is imminent on account of our sins. People express extreme anxiety when a meteor crashes into a city wall very close to Strasbourg. Pamphlets are written when a sow is born, conjoined with another. Actually, in this, you can see the legs growing from the back. There's a huge number of pamphlets were printed and bought. Artists became obsessed with witchcraft. These are works from the Strasbourg artist Hans Baldung, who was a mentee of Albrecht Dürer. Now, one of the reasons that these kinds of things were causing real panic is that there were people like the man on the right, Guido von Kaiserberg, a new wave of clerics who were in the business of condemning the church as being corrupt and worldly and secular, arguing that it needed to return to proper religious values. Now, in one case, a complaint was made by Geiler and the bishop about monks actually living permanently with their mistresses. The mistresses actually had beds in the cloisters. Well, he took the complaint to the Pope, and the Pope reminded him that, come on, they are only men. Now, these kinds of abuses had always been a part of the church, but what was striking in this period is you've got an intellectual movement that's condemning it, and more people who are thinking, the sacraments as delivered by our clergy aren't working because they're too mired in sin. People like Kaiserberg were convincing them that the gap between how priests should be and how they were was so great that it was actually endangering their souls. Here's some wonderful images of lascivious and gluttonous monks and priests. The disposal of an unwanted child here by a deaconess. A monk and nun in stocks, rather wonderful image. Okay, so I'm going to bring this to an end now. In order to understand how you could go from this situation of extreme economic and psychological distress to a compulsive dance, I found it helpful to look at literature from cultural anthropology. And one thing that anthropologists have done very well is study subcultures in which ecstatic religion is the norm, in which religious belief depends upon a belief that you can connect with the supernatural realm, that you can be possessed by demons or by the Holy Ghost or different kinds of deity or force in different religious traditions. But these kinds of ecstatic religious ceremonies have been common to most religious traditions over the course of human history. And even though, if you take something like speaking in tongues, even though it seems to be wild, all of these religious traditions which depend on a notion of possession, they're highly scripted, they're highly formulaic, that once people are in a state in which they're no longer reality checking, once they're in this dissociative trance state, they begin acting in ways that are consistent with what that culture expects. So they really are quite choreographed, even though the person is in a trance. Well, I think, so I started looking for any evidence of such a belief in Strasbourg in this time. What's the evidence that there was a belief that people had that when combined with their terrible distress could have resulted in a compulsive dance? And this takes us back to St. Vitus, the shrine to which the people were taken. Now, Vitus was a Sicilian-born saint who refused to give up his Christianity, and so Emperor Diocletian had him, made every attempt to kill him. He eventually died of natural causes, apparently. But in this region, there was a belief that Saint Vitus inflicted the curse of dancing. And on the right, you can see a couple of, they look like statues, they're actually beautiful paintings on the wall of Cologne Cathedral, which is quite close to Strasbourg, not far from the Rhine. On the right, you have Saint Valentine. Saint Valentine was believed to be capable of inflicting epilepsy. And you can see on the plinth beneath, just about, you can see people falling over. On the left is Saint Vitus. And if you look more closely, what do you see? You see people dancing in a trance-like state. And this is a painting that was completed in about 1500. And on further examination, it became clear that this really was a very widespread belief in Strasbourg and the area at the time. In fact, it was illegal to say to somebody, God give you Saint Vitus, or may Saint Vitus come to you. Because if you curse somebody like this, the idea was that that would bring their sins to the attention of Saint Vitus, who then might actually inflict that the deadly dance upon you. So I think this also makes sense of why people appear to have recovered once they left the shrine in Saverne. It appealed unconsciously to their belief that they had done enough penance and they could now stop their compulsive dancing. I'm going to just jump ahead quickly. Actually, I won't, because I think we'll probably come on to that in questions, and I've been talking much too much. So how about I stop there and take some questions, and maybe we can talk in discussion about modern expressions of this kind of phenomenon. And yeah, I mean, please ask any questions. I mean, if you buy the theory, would like more explanation, anything you like.
How would you connect epilepsy with dance?
I see what you mean. Why would they put those statues right next to one another?
Well, or what is the relationship between epilepsy and dance?
The only connection is in that particular painting in Cologne Cathedral, because basically it's showing that there are all sorts of diseases. They're inflicted by saints, and the saints inflict them and can cure them. So if you developed epilepsy, then you somehow offended Saint Valentine, so you pray to Saint Valentine, and maybe he will relieve you of that condition. Saint Vitus, yeah, is the saint who will inflict you with a dancing curse.
Okay.
And how did that persist? Because even as late as the mid 20th century, there were some pretty widespread, unfortunate associations with epilepsy, and that people were somehow cursed or less capable intellectually, or variety of negative associations.
Yeah, I don't know very much about the history of epilepsy, but I can email a book about it. One thing I would say is that the tendency to go to a shrine if you're enduring a serious disease does decline, and certainly by the 1700s is becoming much less frequent. But I'll say something about the Saint Vitus shrine. People with movement disorders, because Saint Vitus is the saint who is said to inflict them and remove them, they continue to visit Saint Vitus's shrine. And I'm sure what you say about epilepsy continues to this day. When it became uncommon, I'm afraid I can't say. Yes, that's a very inadequate answer to your question. But certainly this kind of the Saint Vitus belief that you could have a compulsive dancing, that seems to disappear by the late 1500s.
Mm.
Is she asleep?
Does anyone else have
question.
any comments for John?
Yeah, I had a question real quick, Dr. Waller, if I could ask real quick. This is somewhat related to the epilepsy question that was just asked, but I know there are some historical studies that relate around the genetic variants within a population. So I was curious as to whether there was any genetic predisposition within the population of Strasbourg that might have been studied within your research that might make that certain population more prone or more susceptible to the condition or the stimulus that caused the dancing plague.
It's an interesting question. I don't think there's a need for an additional explanation myself. I mean, the conditions were so unimaginably terrible, and this was the area where they had the belief that was required, I think, to channel distress in this direction. I mean, I think there may be other factors involved. I'm not aware of any work on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and what's so interesting is that as soon as the belief in Saint Vitus inflicting this dance recedes, this kind of phenomenon ceases to happen. And the only other places it's happened, there's a case in, I think, Morocco, one in Madagascar. The Madagascar one is mid-19th century, and there's a late 19th century example in Brazil, again with compulsive dancing on a very large scale, all in places with a belief that certain deities or spirits can cause this kind of behavior.
Can you cite some examples of modern hysteria that would somehow relate to the historical examination of the subject that you've just given us?
Yeah, sure. So there are a number of ways in which we respond to distress that are conditioned by the mind. And I always thought this was quite a good corrective against our modern emphasis on the biological explanation. I don't think this doesn't mean that we have to go the full Freudian hog, but nonetheless, we can clearly see the way in which beliefs play a role. But you see quite often cases of what's called mass anxiety hysteria. So that's where somebody might believe that he or she has been exposed to a poisonous gas or being poisoned by food. And that can quite easily spread to lots of people. And they start taking deep breaths, sweating, and vomiting, where there's no biological cause at all. So that kind of thing happens periodically. There's something else, what psychiatrists call mass motor hysteria. It's where you've got a sustained period of stress that builds up, and then it takes very specific forms in particular historical periods. And a classic example of this is if you've seen images of men from World War I suffering from shell shock, and they've developed an inability to speak or hear. They can't feel sensation on their skin. They've lost the ability to walk properly. All of these presentations of war neurosis were incredibly common in World War I, much less common in World War II, and hardly happened at all in Vietnam, and haven't happened after. So within that particular period, their distress was expressed in a certain way. It would be called conversion disorder, the way in which the psychological stress leads to some kind of physical expression. But then you've also got quite a number of cases like the Strasbourg one, where it's a bit, let me mention another one along those lines. You may have heard of the Tanzanian laughter epidemic, This happened right after what was then Tanganyika achieved independence from Britain. And in a very strict girls' school, a few girls started laughing compulsively. And then it spread through the school, and there were dozens of girls who were laughing themselves sick day after day. And then, not very sensibly, they sent everyone home, rather like universities are doing now. And then they spread it to dozens and dozens of villages throughout Tanzania. So that kind of thing happens quite a lot, particularly within very strict schools, religiously run schools for the most part. In other cases, you get the development of paralysis, where a few students just find that they can no longer walk, and it spreads and spreads and spreads, and there's no physical cause at all. There's another set of cases which is much more along the lines of where we would use the term mass hysteria, where in a period of severe social and economic distress, a group of people adopt a belief that in normal times would have seemed implausible. And an example of that is called Koro. And this is the belief in genital theft. And there's a long European history of this too. But now in parts of Southeast Asia and a few parts of East and West Africa, young men particularly can become convinced that due to witchcraft or the actions of a spirit, their penis has either been stolen or it's slowly being retracted into the body. And they turn up at hospitals absolutely terrified. And sometimes people are identified as maybe causing this phenomenon. And then there are quite a number of cases of them being killed. So there's a whole gamut of ways in which the ideas, the beliefs that people have can shape the way in which they respond to psychological distress. That answer was all over the place, but there are plenty of instances of strangeness caused by distress.
Marna was next.
This is fascinating. So my question is, do you see a parallel to the acceptance of the existence of coronavirus and COVID-19 today? I just heard a piece on NPR this afternoon that said coronavirus is so widespread, but there are individuals generally in smaller populated areas that simply do not believe that coronavirus exists, which I find utterly fascinating. So what do you think about that, John?
I thought this was one topic that couldn't possibly get political. There are, I think, I mean, maybe others here can suggest parallels better than I can. I mean, there is a sense in which what you see here in Strasbourg is a development of a particular belief system in a broad area, but it's one large slice of Europe that thinks this way, that really believes there is a saint who can curse you with dancing. So there was an element of the fashionable term now tribalism in what happened in Strasbourg, and clearly the way in which people respond to threats like COVID can be profoundly shaped by their membership of a group which has certain values and beliefs and suspicions. What's interesting is that where we see irrationality, it normally swings in the opposite direction to a greater fear and paranoia and belief in external threats, not a belief that you're actually immune or that those threats don't exist. Mm-hmm. So coronavirus is a very, very peculiar case. You know, it's much more common to believe that the communists are trying to take over, or certain people are likely to explode a bomb in your midst, or you know, there's a this is leading to bizarre complacency, not paranoid fear. So I think probably in the most fundamental level, it's totally different in expression. Yes, really interesting question.
I like that question as well. Does anyone else have any questions for John?
I have a question.
Go ahead, James.
In the talk, there were several explanations that have come up as to why this happened. I may have missed. Did you indicate your conclusion as to why this happened in this place at this time? And does it relate some way to your title of your book? I'd like to hear more about your book on the subject. And
yeah. I mean, for me, there's only one explanation that can work here, and that it is mass psychogenic illness. And it, I mean, the book does a much, I think, better job of explaining it, because in order for that theory to work, you have to have people who are in a trance state. If they're not in a trance state, they're not going to believe that they've been cursed by the saint. But they're also actually not going to be able to dance for days and days and days, because the pain would have become absolutely insufferable. But if you are in that dissociative state, where you've got a very partial awareness of reality, you can dance and dance and dance, and you could certainly dance yourself to death in that kind of condition. So yeah, part of the explanation is you've got to explain how people can get into that trance state. And a big part of that is recognizing that these people are being raised in a culture which believes in possession. It believes in the possibility of being cursed by a saint like Saint Vitus. So that belief gets them into that position. But they've also got to basically give up. They've got to give up hope. They've got to believe that God has completely forsaken them, and that this is they're exactly the kind of people who are going to be targeted by an angry saint. So that again pushes them further towards this dissociative state in which they act on that belief. So I think it's very much a case of mass psychogenic illness. One other thing that I didn't emphasize enough is that the city authorities do the worst thing imaginable. They make these people dance in public. And this is one of the most thriving market cities in Europe. And rather than forcing people into their homes or putting them in cellars somewhere, they build a stage and hire musicians and dancers. So if you want to create the conditions for a psychic contagion, you really couldn't have done better than what they did. So you can imagine that anybody walking past this bizarre spectacle, who has any doubt about his or her moral purity, they're going to look at that and think, oh my God, it's me next. And as soon as you start having those thoughts, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then you're sucked in, and then it adds you to that crowd of dancers.
I can't help if I could just ask one more question. Is this in any way related to the fact that the Reformation in Germany is beginning at this time? Is there? I don't know how to phrase it or anything, but it's a big event to happen at that time.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the answer is yes and no. It's no in the sense that although Strasbourg was going to become an absolute center of Protestant belief and radical religion, so many of the leading thinkers of Strasbourg at this time are going to become many of the leading lights of the Protestant Reformation. Protestantism and news about Luther's protest was barely known at this point in Strasbourg, or a little bit was known, but the Reformation was clearly only just gathering momentum. However, it's very relevant in the sense that the kind of critique against the established church launched by Luther, the worldliness of monks and nuns and priests, the selling of things like indulgences, this is a point at which you could buy forgiveness for your sins in advance of having committed your sin. So that kind of worldliness is exactly what's under attack in Strasbourg by people like Gila von Kaiserberg. And I think one of the key things they do is, while previous generations may have been okay by with fornicating priests and monks and so forth, they might have agreed that they're just men. In this period, people are much more likely to question it and worry about whether the sacraments are working, because you've got people saying this is wrong, that you're being alienated from God and the chance of salvation because of the misbehavior of the church. So in that general sense, I think the Reformation is absolutely relevant to this.
Good questions. Does anyone else in the group have questions? You can either put them in the chat or just blurt them out if you feel comfortable. Sandy, you can go.
Okay, we had to unmute. Our question is, what is the cure for this?
Yes, a good question. The chronicles don't say very much about what happened to bring this to an end, but I think if this were a case of mass psychogenic illness, then it'd be reasonable to expect that the cure was the one that they finally arrived at, which was doing something that appealed to the religious logic that was driving it. And if their belief is that they're dancing because they've been cursed by Saint Vitus, then if they're taken to the shrine of Saint Vitus and they perform all of the correct rituals, which they do, then to the extent that they were aware of reality, it would speak directly to what they thought they had to do. So I'm guessing that they did actually recover, at least most of them after. Certainly when there's a very famous but utterly bizarre physician called Paracelsus, who arrives in Strasbourg in 1526, and he writes down quite a lot about what happened and names the person who probably started it. There's no indication in what he says that it's still ongoing. So it's certainly by 1526, it's completely died out. So yeah, I think that's the best I could do for an answer. And I think it makes sense. I showed an image a few times, a rather beautiful engraving with a woman being held up by musicians. And that's by Peter Bruegel the Elder. And if you go down to where the Rhine pours into the North Sea, what is now Belgium, that's where Bruegel produced that image. And by the 1530s, he describes how what had been a spontaneous involuntary dance before had actually been harnessed as part of a religious ritual. So every year on the same date, people in Belgium would dance themselves into a trance with the help of musicians, and they would dance being held up all the way to a shrine dedicated to St. John. So it was St. John's disease there and St. Vitus's disease in the Strasbourg area. So there they've actually turned this into a healing ritual. And as far as one can tell, the people who danced into a trance in this penitential way, they felt better for a while. Incidentally, the Tarantella of southern Italy was basically the same kind of story. People said they were dancing because they'd been bitten by a spider, but it's quite clear that people in extreme distress fell into a trance accompanied by music and then felt relief having danced for a couple of days. So I do think it healed them.
Really good question. Does anyone else have a question they want to put into the chat or that they want to say out loud? Carol, I think you have a question. Yes?
I do. This reminds me, and I don't think you've used the term in this presentation, but whirling dervishes. What association might there be with that?
Yes, yes, it's a really good point. I think that the whirling dervishes I do not know a lot about, although the what that kind of cultural religious phenomenon I think is enormously relevant to what we see happening here. The role of movement and belief of getting you into this dissociative state. And although conventional Christianity now has pretty much stripped away that ecstatic component of going into these trance states. So of course, in the early church, it was almost certainly very common, as it has been in most religious traditions. It's as a means of feeling closer to a supernatural. It seems to be a very, very effective kind of religious, what's described as religious experience. Did you want to add anything about the whirling dervishes? I wish I could say more about that specific case.
Well, I did just check a definition, and it's described as a member of a Muslim or specifically Sufi religious order who's taken vows of poverty and austerity. Dervishes first appeared in the 12th century, noted for their wild or ecstatic rituals known as dancing, whirling, or howling dervishes, according to the practice of their order. So something that they might have known they were getting into or expected to participate in.
Yeah, the anthropological literature is very rich on cultures that still promote the trance state, which of course, and if you're raised in a culture where there's an expectation that you will that your spirit or your soul will rise into a supernatural realm, then just by growing up seeing other people enter this state, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you're older, it's much easier for you to succumb to this mental state in the same way. But it's very, the whirling dervishes are one example among hundreds of this behavior being cultivated.
I see your hand, Sandy. Let me make sure no one else has another question before. No other questions? Okay, go ahead. Marcy, go first, and then we'll jump back to you, Sandy, if that's okay.
Just wondered what type of research you're working on now.
So this book was a micro study of one event in one place in 1 year, in fact, one season. I've now gone to the opposite extreme, and I'm doing a book that starts with the development of agriculture about 10,000 years ago and comes up to the present, trying to work out if there's any pattern to how human groups treat one another. And if there are patterns, if there are consistencies, what are the consistent factors associated with treating people in one way or another? And that's overwhelming in a way. I mean, this was great fun, but the amount of source material surviving wouldn't allow me to write anything more than a short book on it. The one I'm writing at the moment has been weighing me down for well over a decade.
Oh, wow.
Sandy, go ahead with your question, and then we'll move to Larry's question. He asked it in the group chat.
Can you comment on the Pentecostal tradition of speaking in tongues? Does this fall into the same category of moving into a trance for religious purposes.
Yeah, I mean, of course, yeah, others would have very different explanations. But yeah, my grandmother would speak in tongues and would assure me that it was the Holy Ghost. But it's very, very consistent with so many other traditions, including the whirling dervishes mentioned by Carol. That if you're in an environment in which this is an expectation, and I find it a fascinating phenomenon. But it's so similar, I think, to what happened in 1518, and that once people were dissociating, their behavior would draw upon this script that they've internalized. They knew that they'd been cursed to dance, and that's what they proceeded to do. The only difference with Strasbourg is that it was involuntary. And the sources are absolutely adamant about this. Well, first of all, that it was a dance, and second, that people didn't want to be doing it. That it wasn't some kind of political protest movement or something like that. So I think that conceptually it's very, very close to the phenomena like speaking in tongues.
Good question. I'm going to read Sandy's question in the chat. Not Sandy's, Larry's. I'm so sorry. For those who didn't die from prolonged dancing, did they fall victim a second or multiple times? And does the record include any narratives from those who succumbed to this phenomenon?
Yeah, those are really good questions, Larry. Thank you. The answer is no. Well, certainly no to the second question. Now, there are a number of indications that the primary victims of this dancing phenomenon were poor. The fact that, one thing I didn't mention is that Frau Trophea was apparently taken to the shrine of St. Vitus very early on. So after maybe 2 or 4 days of dancing, there's a chronicle that says that her master, we know who that was. It was an aristocrat who was very senior in the Strasbourg hierarchy. He had actually paid for her to go to that shrine dedicated to St. Vitus. She couldn't afford to make her own way there. It seems that the people very early on were convinced that this was all to do with St. Vitus. It was only the city authorities who, for the most part, said, no, this is hot blood. And for reasons we don't understand, said they've got to dance more. At the very end, when they scoop people up and send them to the shrine, again, there are indications that it was the poor. It was said that they had to give money to each one of them so they could make a financial offering to the hermit who lived at the shrine. Now, clearly, if they've got their own cash, they're going to spend it on getting better. So this is a very long way round to the answer. We're talking here about the kind of people who leave no historical record. They certainly don't leave a written record. They're illiterate. Their sufferings, unless they're absolutely bizarre like they are here, are beneath the notice of the elites of cities like Strasbourg. So we don't have that kind of record. Whether some of them succumbed again, nobody knows. There's no indication in the chronicles that there was another outbreak. What I would say, and I should have mentioned this before, there was a huge outbreak in 1374, which consumed big parts of northeastern France, Belgium, what's now Holland, and northwestern Germany. And that involved thousands of people. The reason I didn't write about that one is that it's you don't have the advantage of these memos that are passing between members of the governing council. So you don't get the same kind of immediacy to the story you can tell. But in that case, it's quite clear that people were dancing for days on end, and they would stop for a while, and then they would start again, stop and start again. There are clear descriptions in the chronicles of that happening. So it's quite likely that that also happened in Strasbourg. But one other thing I'd say about 1518 is that, first of all, the city belatedly did exactly the right thing by taking them to the shrine. The second thing is, I'm speculating, but if you can imagine being absolutely desperately poor, barely surviving, and all of a sudden the authorities is not only taking you quite some distance to a shrine, they put these red shoes on you, they blessed you, they've led you round a shrine, they've allowed you to participate in all of these elaborate rituals. That's got to do you some psychological good, it would seem to me. Maybe for the first time in your life, your suffering has not been beneath the dignity of the elites to recognize. So I think that may well have meant, so they were doing two things that were helpful. They weren't ignoring the plight of the poor, and they were appealing to their religious sensibilities. So it may be that there wasn't a recurrence in Strasbourg because they'd actually done the right thing in this case. The people largely recovered. Actually, I'm going to squeeze in one other thing. If you were a desperate, angry member of the peasant classes in the 1520s, there was an alternative too. You could be one of the hundreds of thousands of peasants who joined the German Peasants War that came to a peak in 1525 when thousands of peasants occupied Saverne, where the St. Vitus shrine is. They were holed up there, and then they were absolutely slaughtered by aristocratic armies. Tens of thousands left dead in the field. So they had an alternative outlet in the early 1520s that was soon closed off in the most brutal fashion.
It's now 5:21 on my time, but 6:21 Eastern time. So is there any last questions? I know there was one question that I needed to ask about the recording, but does anyone have any more questions? One last question before I turn to my question. I'm checking, let me see. Nope, I don't think anyone has any more questions. Someone, Dr. Waller, someone in the chat asked, John, sorry, asked, where will these recordings actually be at? Because I know we're recording it now, but where will they be at after this is over so that they can go back and look at them?
That's an excellent question, and I don't know. I think we're going to have, I'll try and find out what we'll do with them next week. I'm guessing that they'll go on the Age Alive website. But I've not spoken to Claire about that. So hopefully I'll have something to tell you this time next week about that. But we will get them up soon. Yep.
Okay, and if she gives us an answer before then, I can make sure to send it out to everyone.
Great. Thank you, Wisdom.
Thank you guys for participating today and asking some really thoughtful questions.
I will after this, I'm going to send out an email with some links to reading material, but also a link to a Jonathan Glazer, who is quite a well-known artsy director, did a take on COVID, lockdown COVID, based on this story, and it of wild dancers in their own rooms to techno. Not everybody's cup of tea, but I'll send it round anyway.
You mentioned survey. What are you referencing, Barbara? Oops, I'm sorry. Someone is at my front door.
Yes. Thanks, Barbara. In the email I sent about 3 hours ago, there was a link to a survey. And please give us as much information as you can, how we can improve on things, different topics you'd like to see covered, and also anybody who might be interested in these sessions, please let us know, and then forward the information, or I'm happy to contact them as well.
I'm also putting the link in the chat if that's easier for everyone.
Right. Thank you, Wisdom.
I sent that off now. So before you leave, if you click that link, it'll take you to the survey, which you can take right after we're heading off now. That'll be greatly appreciated. I hope to see you all next week with Dr. Nwando and Achobi, and we're gonna have some really great talks, and I'm gonna also be moderating. So I hope to see you all next week. Stay safe, stay healthy. Bye. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, Wisdom. And do please, join us next week. Wando Achebe is one of the finest historians of West African history. She's a really, really good MSU scholar. She's I think she's going to give a presentation from a chapter of her most recent book about West African queens. It'll be good. Thank you all.